Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and I wanted to talk about a graphic novel that I read about a week ago. Final Crisis was written by Grant Morrison, and it came out in 2008. There were a few artists on this book. It started off with J.G. Jones. I think by the end of the miniseries, Doug Mahnke was working on it some, and a couple of other artists. I don't remember their names, unfortunately, right off the top of my head. And this is a book that I have been waiting to read for a very long time now. It is basically tied in with everything that Grant Morrison has ever written at DC Comics. And if you are unaware, that is actually a lot of stuff. Starting with his JLA run from the 1990s, that run loosely sets up his Seven Soldiers mega series, which ties in a little bit with Final Crisis, and that ties in with Batman R.I.P., which ties in with the rest of his Batman run, which itself is like 8 years of Batman stories. So basically, in order to read everything in order, I had to wait a long time to get through certain things. It took me several months to read 52. I took a very long break in between two of the volumes, so it took me a long time to get to this book, and when I finally did, well, it took me about 4 years to get there because it's been that long since this story came out. So before reading this, I had come across a few other people who had, let's say, strong opinions about this book. I did not seek out reviews of this book because I wanted to remain unspoiled before getting into the meat of the story. But I did accidentally come across a few people, and basically the general reaction that I saw was that this story made absolutely no sense at all and was completely 100% unreadable. And I will say that did color my expectations a little bit. When I first got into this book, I thought all of those people were crazy. I thought this basically makes quite a bit of sense. This is roughly the same Grant Morrison that we've had in every other story that he's ever done. I will say, by the end of the book, I can understand those complaints a little more. It's not nearly as coherent at the end as it is at the beginning. I will say, this book that I read does not just contain the 7-issue Final Crisis miniseries. It also collects 2 issues of a miniseries called Superman Beyond, and it collects an issue called Final Crisis Submit. And both of those were written by Grant Morrison as well, and according to Grant Morrison, you really should read them in a certain order. I think 3 issues of Final Crisis, then 2 issues of Superman Beyond, then an issue of Final Crisis Submit, and then the rest of Final Crisis. And I think you're supposed to read 2 issues of Batman somewhere in there. And actually, I had read those 2 issues of Batman before reading this, because those 2 issues of Batman are collected in the R.I.P. trade. And so when I read those issues, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I thought those issues were connected with an event from Batman's past that was frequently mentioned during R.I.P., so when I started reading Final Crisis and I saw a couple of those characters, I realized, oh, okay, this is what was going on. So needless to say, the whole story is a little bit of a mess. When part of the story that is, air quotes, necessary is in 2 issues of Batman which aren't even collected in the Final Crisis trade and are collected in the R.I.P. trade, that's not great. It didn't overall affect the way I would have enjoyed this story, I don't think. I still feel like this story is more or less unreadable by the time you get to the end, even without those 2 issues of Batman collected within. So specifically, what are some things that I like and dislike about this book? Well, overall, like I said, the beginning of the book is pretty easy to decipher. Even if, for example, you don't know who Dan Turpin is, I feel like you can still read Final Crisis and you can still understand, okay, this is the archetypal grumpy police officer character. He has been all over the place. He's Inspector Kramer from Nero Wolfe. He's Harvey Bullock from the Batman comics. He's Flash from the Batman comics. He's all over the place, except he's not crooked. And even if you don't know anything about Dan Turpin, you can still see what's going on here. You can still see this guy, and you can still understand kind of what's going on with that character. It really isn't until 3 or 4 issues in when I start to get lost. The first 3 issues are basically a very typical battle of good versus evil. And I don't want to say this story is typical. I don't want to say that it is predictable or boring or anything like that. I actually think even though it's typical, it's very fun and enjoyable. It makes sense, though. That's important to understand. The first 3 issues, it's a story of good versus evil that is easy to understand. You see bad guys choosing alliances, you see good guys who are fighting the good fight. There's nothing hard to understand here. Then you get 2 issues of Superman Beyond, and that is where I start to lose a little bit of faith in this whole story. We've got Superman who is looking for this miracle cure that can cure Lois Lane, because basically her heart is going to stop if he doesn't find this stuff. And he meets several other Supermen from different dimensions, a couple of characters who are super-ish, but they are not actually parallel versions of him. And honestly, the bad guy here, I don't understand him. I don't understand his motivations. I even don't understand some of the good guys. We've got an army of monitors. Apparently they are all vampires. Apparently some of them are good vampires and some of them are evil vampires. I don't understand. I don't understand why this ultimate monitor who has been imprisoned for 1,000 years or however long, I don't understand why he's suddenly a threat. A lot of this just didn't make sense. On the surface, it makes plenty of sense. You see Superman guiding a starship so that it's going to fall on a dead world, and then all of our Supermen, they land in limbo. And if you've read Grant Morrison's Animal Man run from the 1990s, then you recognize this place as the limbo from that comic book. Surface details make enough sense, but overall, I didn't really understand what these characters were fighting for. We see this book that apparently is every book in existence all at once, and they're trying to do something. I don't really understand what they are trying to do. And this story, it would be fine if it didn't really tie into Final Crisis. Actually, I probably would still complain, but I think overall we would have a better product if this did not tie into Final Crisis. If this was just a 2-issue story where Superman is getting a cure to help save Lois Lane's life, I would be a-okay with that. But this evil monitor that Superman fights in Superman Beyond is seemingly defeated at the end of issue 2, and then he comes back in Final Crisis. And apparently Superman Beyond issue 2 actually came out after Final Crisis was completely done. So that is definitely a problem. When you have what is supposed to be the middle of a story happening in a 2-issue miniseries that doesn't even finish until the rest of your story is done, that is 100% a problem. And if Grant Morrison thinks that the 2 issues of Superman Beyond and the Final Crisis Submit issue are both crucial when you're reading Final Crisis, I don't understand why he didn't just make this a 10-issue miniseries. If he thinks that those issues are important to the overall story, he should have just made them part of the overall story. And that ties into a rant I did last week about comic book creators shaping the future of the industry, so I'm not going to get into that here. Basically, after the break, where you're reading 3 issues of Final Crisis and then you read these 3 issues that are side stories that are apparently important to the overall narrative, that's when I start to lose track of it all. We jump forward in time, apparently. We see the 2 Flashes, Barry and Wally. They run so fast that they are now in the future, and then we just skip over what is supposed to be months of the bad guys ruling planet Earth, and then apparently this all happened within days. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, and then it just gets worse. We've got stuff happening and I don't even understand it. For one page, we see the 2 atoms working together on something. I actually had to go and read online annotations to understand what they were doing. We see characters who show up and then they never show up again. And we don't know what their purpose was in the story, or we don't know how X got to Y, or how this character knows this bit of information. As the series progresses, it gets more and more confusing. And that's, I think, the ultimate thing that I have to say about this book. I know I'm basically spinning my wheels at this point. There are only so many ways that I can say the further you get into this book, the less it makes sense. Overall, this is not the least readable Grant Morrison comic ever. I will say this is better written than Sebastian O, which is one of my absolute least favorite Grant Morrison comics ever, and it makes more sense than Flex Mentallo, which is a pretty looking book that made absolutely no kind of sense. And I think anyone who said that Final Crisis is unreadable or makes no sense to them, those people need to take a look at Flex Mentallo, and then I think they will be a little more kind with Final Crisis. Having said that, this book is not the completely understandable, easy to read story that I think defenders of this book label it as. I think there is too much side stuff going on that is crucially important here. If you haven't read the Seven Soldiers miniseries from a few years prior to this, you're not going to understand the new gods being in human bodies on Earth. You're going to see that and you're going to be very confused if you are familiar with DC history. Overall, I would say if you're interested in this book, you need to be really interested in this book if you're going to buy it. I would say if you're casually interested in this book, don't bother. If you wanted to pick up all of the big, air quotes, crisis stories from DC Comics, I would say skip this one because it's not something that you really need to read. It doesn't have that much of an effect on the DC universe. That, to me, that's not as important as it being a good story as far as I'm concerned, but I know a lot of people that really matters. So if you're the kind of person who thinks that this story should have a giant impact on the DC universe, then this is definitely not that. And it also is just not that great of a story in the first place. I think it starts off pretty great and then it kind of falls down as it goes. That's about all I have to say here. I hope that this review was more coherent than the story anyway. I hope that it was helpful for you. If it was, I hope you will like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back tomorrow with a different kind of video. So until then, I'll see you guys later. Have a great day.